Good evening. Hello. Thanks for joining us. Tonight we're going to be talking to Daniel Knowles about his latest book, Reaping the Whirlwind, which looks at the perceptions of bomber command and how that's changed since the war. It's a fabulous subject, and we're really lucky to have Daniel here tonight talking to us about it. Firstly, a quick introduction to Barnthorn Publishing. We're an independent publishing house that was established just over 2 years ago now. We're very lucky to have the likes of Daniel, who are, existing authors, but we're also lucky to have first-time authors, and it gives us a nice contrast in our styles that we see. Mainly military history subjects, particularly Second World War, First World War, and the Anglo-Zulu War. So yeah, if you're interested in finding out more, head to our website. Don't be shy, feel free to reach out to us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Daniel to introduce himself and give us a little bit about his background.
Thanks, Ashley. Good evening, everyone. Yes, sir. I'm a military historian based in Newcastle upon Tyne, Northern England. Um, for me, history is just one of my great loves. It all started for me on a family holiday when I was 7 or 8 years old, over to the Normandy beachhead. And, at school prior to that, I had done the Romans, the ancient Greeks, the Tudors, and I wasn't really interested in history, but something about, you know, walking around Pegasus Bridge, visiting Sword and Juna on that holiday, something clicked. And it's been a bit of an obsession since then, the war and just learning all about it and the different nuances and the battles, the campaigns, the equipment, the men and the personal stories. It's just been, you know, well, just a treasure trove.
It's an endless slope, really, isn't it? There's already so many things, and you can look in one kind of subject and then find connections to another, and it's just like a big tapestry, really.
It is, and it's one of those subjects where I don't think you always think that you know a lot about a particular area, but then you find something else, be it in a book or an archive or in a documentary, and you think, I didn't know that. And you delve and you discover a full new rabbit hole, which you maybe didn't know existed prior. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you've got obviously still being young, you've got plenty of road ahead of you. So I'm sure there'll be many more kind of rabbit holes to fall down and subjects to discover, and that's the beauty of history. But this isn't your first book, Reaping the Whirlwind, as I mentioned in the intro. So I guess how did your writing journey start? Like what got you into writing?
Um, I would say I've always been interested in writing from a young age. I remember growing up, I would write stories, and that was a pastime for a period, and they weren't very good. And recently, when I was packing up a few things ahead of moving house, discovered a few of them, and they were terrible. Um, it's always been sort of just been there. And that served me well, sort of at A level, then university, and then I was quite fortunate with being able to publish my first book. And it wasn't something that I had intended to write, but it was the right thing which came along at the right time. Um, at the time I was off work, having suffered a motorcycle accident. So I had a broken right hand and a fractured left wrist, so I was in a cast. And I was asked if I would write a book on the German battleship Tirpitz. Um, so between doing research, I was typing one finger, which made it quite a chore. It's quite humorous to look back on. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, literally, yeah. So I guess with this book then, Reaping the Whirlwind, how did that come about?
Um, well, the genesis for that was my university dissertation. So second year, I had to come up with our dissertation topics. So the genesis for this book came back from 2015 when I was at university. Towards the end of second year, we were asked to come up with our dissertation topic, and I mulled over a number of ideas. Stuff to do with D-Day, the Tyne Tees Regiment, and eventually I settled on Bomber Command. At the time, it was the 70th anniversary of the bombing of Dresden, and seeing bits and pieces on the news, um, something clicked, and I thought, well, how has being changed the way Bomber Command have been portrayed throughout history? Because there was a lot about the reconciliation and the bombing and how it had affected people, and how Bomber Command hadn't always been celebrated. Um, and it all just sort of spiraled from there. So I wrote a dissertation, but it was a fairly limited piece, being 10,000 words, um, which as what comes across in this book, there's a lot more to that than meets the eye. It's a very expansive subject, and I probably could have wrote half as much again in this book on subjects that I didn't potentially cover, um, because it is that much of a expansive area for research, and it's an area of research which I would say is it's somewhat neglected.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, as you said, that there's all kinds of way you could have shaped this book together. So, what's been your approach? Kind of, what are the sections of the book really the key, the structure to the conversation, I suppose.
Well, try to break it down into segments. Yes, I've tried breaking the book down into a number of key sections. So, firstly, looking at literature and how our command have been portrayed in non-fiction works. That in itself leads naturally onto, okay, if they've been portrayed in a particular way in non-fiction, how have they been portrayed in fiction? Uh, and within that, obviously, you can look at not only fiction in terms of books, but comic books. I've looked at how Balak have been portrayed in sort of popular culture with things like model kits, so airfix. Because I think everyone knows the first airfix plastic model aircraft was the Spitfire, but it took a few years before Bomber Command were represented. So why was that? Um, and then I've tried focusing on how the media represented Bomber Command, in as much as how were they portrayed during the war and how did that change subsequent to 1945, and then how have they been portrayed in film and television? Because there's a number of films on Bomber Command, but a lot of them are quite sanitized, shall we say, or look at particular rates or provide a fictional account without delving into the full area bombing narrative and delving into that whole subject.
Yeah. And while you're on the subject, I guess, what would be your favorite film that features Bomber Command?
James Jeffries, James Knowles, but yeah, I'll probably be ridiculed by a few individuals for this, not least of which James Jeffries and Jane Guilford Lewis. But The Dambusters, I would say, is probably my favorite film.
It's interesting. I was listening to the podcast the other day, and it's great. They've got so much knowledge on the subject and they're so passionate. But as you say, the Dam Busters get so many people into the subject, and it feels a bit wrong almost to discard it by the wayside and be like, oh well, right, forget about that. Let's focus on everything else. But I think in truth, it's as you say, it's such a broad subject, and books like yours what Jane and James have both been writing about and are writing about, it goes to show there's so much more to this subject than is currently out there.
Yeah, I think it's one of those subjects which it's wrong to say it's been overlooked in the historiography, but I don't think there's necessarily as much out there on Bomber Command as, say, compared to D-Day or some of the other events of the war or campaigns. Um, I think it's probably only really now that we're beginning to rectify that and delve deeper into the subject.
Hmm, definitely. So I guess probably an apt question then. So how has the way Bomber Command is written about, how would you say, have there been changes to that over time?
I would say there's been significant changes over time. I'd say if you look at the way Bomber Command was written about in the media during the Second World War, it was very much a case of we're hitting back at Germany. This is how many pounds of bombs we're dropping. This is how many aircraft are flying on raids. But then from 1945, there's been a significant change. And I would say the rhetoric became quite anti-Bomber Command, anti-bombing of Germany, anti-the airmen, anti-Harris. And there was a multitude of reasons for that. You've got Cold War propaganda, East versus West, the East Germans and the Soviets playing up the idea of the bombing of Dresden and the war crime, which uh, sort of was picked up in Western media. Um, I'd say war guilt to a degree is impacted upon the way in which Bomber Command's been written about. The idea that, you know, was an inhumane campaign to a degree, an impersonal campaign, which I think stands in contrast with the way we in the West like to envisage how the war was fought, in terms of we went to war for Poland, we fought a morale war, a just war, but the bombing of Germany and the ruination of cities and the indiscriminate killing which resulted therein sort of stands in contrast to that, which I
Mm.
think, to a degree, we've had a hard time coming to terms with. Um, yeah, I think to a degree as well, people have latched on to a perception, rightly or wrongly, that the airmen and Harris were quite nonchalant in the way that they went about conducting the campaign and their thoughts on the campaign. There's numerous accounts of airmen saying, well, you know, I'm not particularly bothered if I killed a few Germans. They started the war, they bombed London, we're hitting back. You know, Famously in 1942, in the propaganda film On the Chin, Harris turned around and said that the Germans had entered the war bombing Warsaw, Rotterdam, and a host of other places and thought they could bomb everyone and no one would bomb them, and that Germany had sown the wind and would reap the whirlwind. I think when people have read accounts like that, it takes people aback and makes them think, well, hang on, the inhumane killers, you know, there's no humanity there. It's indiscriminate and wrong, which I think has led to a degree an anti-bomber command, anti-bombing of Germany thought and school of thought. But also, I think you've got to take into account contemporary events. During the 70s, well, sorry, the late 60s and the 70s, I would say that's when the peak anti-bomber and anti-bomber command rhetoric was. But if you look at what was happening in the world at the time, the Vietnam War was in full flow. And when you've got pictures on, TV and in cinema of B-52s and whatever else dropping ordnance left, right, and centre, indiscriminately, you can't help but compare what'd gone before with what was happening at the time. And you know, that did come across in the literature. People compared the bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki to the tonnage of bombs which are being dropped on Vietnam. I would say to a degree that influences the way we view bombing today as well. But since sort of the late 80s, early 90s, there's been a bit of a change, a softening of attitudes, more so since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, which has led to a bit more reconciliation, which softened attitudes. And I think there's been a bit more of an acceptance of what was wrong, what was right, and that ultimately we were at war. And, rightly or wrongly, there were civilian casualties. Cities were bombed. Germany bombed cities. Britain bombed cities. America bombed cities. That was the way the war was fought. And to a degree, we've got to accept that.
Hmm. And I think, I guess when you contrast Bomber Command with Fighter Command, Fighter Command rightly are seen as heroes. They were the goalkeepers as such that, were stopping, the Germans going about the same campaign we're discussing the other way round. And I think you know, there's probably very little dispute there in terms of, feeling, oh well, we're supporting the wrong side here. But I guess maybe, having lived through that to some extent and known what it felt like to be under the cosh, perhaps in some people's minds, I guess on one hand they may have been very unsympathetic, and as you said, it was kind of an eye for an eye. On the other hand, they may have been completely sympathetic, and I think it's just very interesting. They are all heroes, really, the Bomber Command and Fighter Command, completely. But it's very interesting the social aspect to this that you've just described there, and we'll continue to discuss. Yeah, it is it's great that you've written about it.
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on the point that you've made there, there's no doubting the heroism of fighter command. But to paraphrase Churchill, he said that the fighters were the salvation and that the bombers would bring victory.
Mm.
So fighter command did its bit saving Britain in 1940, denying the Luftwaffe air supremacy, so an invasion couldn't be launched. And bomber command was one of the tools for victory. And I think that's often overlooked. And I think part of the problem is a lot of people are writing about Bomber Command. They were writing 10, 15, 20, some instances 30 years after the war. They didn't necessarily live it and experience it. And I think it's very easy for anyone to sit there as an armchair general and say, well, why did you do that? That was wrong. This was the right decision. You can see it today with arguments over in the build-up to D-Day, was the transportation plan or the oil plan the best method, or was the bombing of Germany a better option? It's very easy to sit there with the benefit of hindsight and say, what is the best option? But when you're there at the time making decisions on limited intelligence, then, you know, mistakes will be made, and you can only ultimately make the decision with the information that you've got at the time. And I think that's an important element of the historiography is, yes, you can sit there and say, okay, how do you analyze this? What could have been done differently? But equally, what was the decision made at the time and why was that? And I think it's that why which is often overlooked.
Indeed. Um, you mentioned earlier on a word that's probably become synonymous with Bomber Command, and obviously we can delve into that. Dresden. Why do you think that Dresden has come to kind of symbolize the bombing of Germany, and as such as also a kind of a rallying point of sorts of the condemnation of Bomber Command?
Well, I think that reason is several-fold. I think first and foremost, you've got the idea that Dresden was an untouched city in February 1945, and Bomber Command rocked up, conducted a raid, and created a firestorm. Um, you've also got the fact that Dresden is linked with the fallout of strategic bombing. It was within weeks of Dresden that Churchill released a memo saying, we shouldn't be bombing German cities anymore, and Bomber Command's raids were sort of curtailed. And I think in large part, the reason it's synonymous is the way in which Dresden was announced to the world. So there was a briefing on how Bomber Command had hit targets in Germany, and it was a ill-advised briefing, shall we say, where words were used which potentially shouldn't have been used, and a dispatch from the Associated Press somehow evaded the censors and made its way over to America and to the neutral press. And the words that were used were that Allied air chiefs had finally made the decision to launch the long-awaited, sorry, they had made the long-awaited decision to adopt terror bombing, um, which I think is really the turning point and is the reason why Dresden is synonymous with Bomber Command, in as much as what was an ordinary raid all of a sudden was framed as a terror raid. And from there, it's spurred a whole host of propaganda. You've got casualty figures which have ranged from high to the extreme and to the unbelievable and unrealistic. Um, Joseph Goebbels, he got the figures, and preliminary figures that he was given said 10,000 had perished, and he added an extra zero onto that and magically created 100,000, which was then reported in the Swiss press and the Swedish press and led to questions in the House of Commons based on those articles, which brought more into the public forethought. Because while bombing had been sort of spoken about in the papers, all of a sudden there's hard, or what appeared to be hard casualty figures being printed on the front pages, questions being asked in the comments, have 100,000 people really been killed? And I think the historiography since then has helped to cement Bomber Command with Dresden because of the casualty figures, because you've had not only 100,000, but some instances, 250,000 people being killed. There's been talk about, you know, extreme numbers of refugees in the city, or it being just full of civilians. And within that, there's the idea that civilians are innocent and that they're non-combatants. And that is a full rabbit hole that you can go down, combatant versus non-combatant, because you can argue being a total war, no civilian was necessarily innocent because, well, they may not have been on the front line in uniform, they're there in the factories, they're there manning, you know, uh, air raid posts, etc., etc. So they're all performing a vital function to the war effort. Um, there's the idea that Dresden had no strategic importance at the time of its destruction, and it was destroyed simply because Bomber Command had run out of targets, and that Churchill had apparently said, "We want to give the Soviets an idea of our destructive potential and what we can do." Um, I think as well, there's the fact that the raid occurred in February 1945, and that leads into the indiscriminate nature of the bombing and the idea that the bombing was unnecessary, which has helped to make Bomber Command synonymous with Dresden, because a lot of questions surround, well, why did Bomber Command target Dresden in February 1945? The end of the war was in sight. It ended on the 8th of May, but that overlooks the crucial arguments of at the time. Yes, the war was going to end in 1945 in Europe, but no one knew exactly when. And overlooks the fact that less than a month prior, the Germans had launched or had been fighting the Battle of the Bulge. It had launched in December 1944 and were still fighting it in mid-January 1945.
Hmm.
So the Germans still clearly had fight in them, so there was no guarantee that they were going to surrender in May. Fortunately, they did, but certainly in February 45, no one could be quite sure when that was going to be. Um, but I think also because of the propaganda of the casualty figures and the furor which surrounded the bombing of Dresden, it was picked up by anti-war movements, um, and was used in Cold War propaganda, which has helped to cement its legacy. And, you know, as I've already touched on with contemporary events, articles on Vietnam specifically reference Dresden and the bombing of Dresden, which helps to keep it in the public consciousness and makes it to be, uh, no pun intended, but it blows it out of proportion to a degree. And
Hmm.
it's a bigger issue than what it necessarily needs to be, and has helped to sort of create this monolithic extremity of bombing, which is, synonymous with Bomber Command and the destructive potential.
And I guess as you've highlighted there, there's a lot of focus perhaps around the casualties on obviously on the ground, civilians or competent casualties on the ground. Perhaps less so on air crews. And is that fair?
I would say so. Um, I mean, when it comes to the casualty figures, depending on who you read and where you get your figures from, there's different casualty figures. I mean, the US Strategic Bombing Survey, which is 50 volumes or 56 volumes, that gives three different sets of figures depending on which volume that you read. the official British histories give their own figures. The West German government came up with their own casualty figures. So no one's quite sure on that. And as seen with the historiography of Dresden, there's different casualty figures bandied around all the time. And you know, everyone focuses on the casualty figures of the German civilians or the bombing of French towns and cities and how many were killed there, but everyone overlooks the 55,000 who were killed in Bomber Command, which it is a shame. And personally, I don't think it's necessarily right. On average, or approximately 125,000 individuals served with Bomber Command during the course of the war. 55,000 were killed, which is around a 44% casualty rate, which is extraordinary. Officers during the First World War had a better chance of survival than an airman in Bomber Command. The only branch of the armed forces of any combatant at the time which had a higher casualty rate was the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine. Um, so I think it's wrong to sort of overlook the casualties of Bomber Command. And while overlooking the casualties of Bomber Command, it's overlooked that the airmen were volunteers. You know, they, they put themselves on the line voluntarily. No one conscripted them to go and fly sorties over Germany and elsewhere over occupied Europe. So, you know, in that regard, I think it's wrong to brush over the casualty figures. Um, I mean, the Air Ministry did recognise that casualties were high. In December 1939, daylight bombing was paused and a switch was made to night bombing because the casualty rates weren't sustainable. But Bomber Command did suffer heavy casualties on its operations. You've got Black Thursday from December 1943, where 23 aircraft were lost on return to Britain because of fog. They either crashed or they ran out of fuel, and men died arguably unnecessarily in that regard. And you've got the raid on Nuremberg, where 96 aircraft were lost, um, which it's a hell of a sacrifice. If you think of using Nuremberg as the example, on average you've got around 500 aircraft going out on a raid, and 96 don't return because they've been shot down. That's a It's a lot of aircraft. It's a lot of airmen to lose,
Hmm.
and it's not sustainable. So I think it's wrong to overlook the casualties of Bomber Command, and I think by ignoring the casualty figures of Bomber Command, we don't honour the legacy of those that served and those that paid the ultimate sacrifice. I think we'd do them and ourselves a disservice. Um, because as I say, they were volunteers. They didn't have to go and fight in Bomber Command, but they chose to fly sorties over Germany. And without glorifying it, I think we need to applaud them for that courage. I wouldn't like to be stuck in a Lancaster or a Halifax at night in minus 30 degrees over Germany being shot at. Um, I think anyone who would like that is probably crazy. Um, so the fact that they were willing to do that and put it on the line in that regard, you know, it's wrong to overlook that fact. I mean, I've got some figures written down here, and of 100 airmen, 55 generally would be killed in an operation or would die of wounds associated with it. 3 would suffer injuries of various degrees. 12 would be taken prisoners of war. 2 would shut down in escape recapture, and the rest, totally 27, would survive an operational tour. When you break it down, your chances of survival aren't that great, or your chances of coming through unscathed aren't particularly high. So I think to minimize the sacrifice by overlooking Bomber Command's casualty figures whilst focusing on German casualty figures or French casualty figures is to a degree wrong.
Definitely. I think if you also reflect upon the how warfare had evolved, obviously, Germany Obviously, well, they started it for a start, but they came with, the Blitz. Obviously, we endured that and overcame it. We then obviously turned the tables, and Bomber Command went back to their ground. But that wasn't the end of Germany's aggressive campaign. Obviously, using the Vengeance weapons with V1s, V2s, they they were coming back at us still, even later in the war. But yet these weapons were unmanned mostly, and I think that's interesting that it's hard to, vilify those weapons necessarily. Obviously, someone on the ground had to fuel them up and press fire and make sure it was all ready to go. But compared to the crew of a Lancaster, as you say, going through that ordeal that they had to, it's quite wrong then that they are you know the fingers pointed at them, as you say, rather than it being the overall view of total war, the decisions that have been made, etc. So obviously, any casualty of war is a grave, and I think that should include Bomber Command, and they should be remembered respectfully.
Yeah, no, it's a valid point because I think today, particularly, we take for granted, over the horizon weaponry and you know, guided missiles, whereas during the Second World War, to drop your bombs on a target, you had to, by and large, see the target.
Mhm.
You know, Lancaster had a crew of seven, and that's seven men who had to go all the way to wherever the target happened to be to drop the payload. Whereas I think we struggle today to comprehend that because you can press a button either in a fighter jet or on a ship or on a land-based system and drop the same payload from many thousand miles away without having to go anywhere near the target.
Indeed, and I guess with the U.S. Army Air Force, they were conducting precision raids of sorts for the time against Germany, where obviously Bomber Command were kind of persevering with more like area bombing. What were the kind of reasons around that?
Well, I think that's probably opening a little bit of a can of worms to a degree, um, because I would say when push come to shove, the US Army Air Force didn't conduct a precision bombing campaign against Germany. Um, the theory of precision bombing holds the idea that specific objectives like airfields or factories are being targeted, whereas the idea of area bombing is linked with indiscriminate bombing, where you just plaster a wide area and you'll hit the target. Um, in March 1944, internally the American bombing campaign was criticized because there had been, well, analysis done, and what the Americans found was that there was no real difference between the idea of precision bombing and area bombing. The two were believed to be more or less one and the same because of the results. Um, and it was a case of if precision bombing is morally indistinguishable from area bombing, and area bombing is akin to terror bombing, then precision bombing is therefore indistinguishable from terror bombing. And that was the dilemma the Americans faced. Um, I mean, American bombing plans, which were formulated at the beginning of the war, said that an aircraft such as the B-17 with its Norden bomb sight had a 1.2% chance of hitting a 100-foot target from 20,000 feet. So within that, they worked out that they would need 220 aircraft to hit the target, which that in itself doesn't lend itself to the argument of precision bombing. You know, I mean, there's talks about, and there's articles written about Harris seeing the results of raids of Bomber Command, where a particular target, like a factory, had been given as an aiming point just to satisfy the point blank directive, for example. And you would look at the post-raid photographs and say, okay, we maybe need to extend the aiming point a little bit, and the aiming point would be adjusted so Bomber Command could say, okay, we've hit the target. To a degree, it's the same with the Americans. But I think there's a lot of focus put on the Northern bomb sight and the claim that the Americans could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 15,000 feet, which that wasn't official American doctrine. It came from Northern marketing when they were trying to sell the bomb sight to the US Army Air Force. Um, and also, you've got the fact that the Norden was undoubtedly a good bomb sight, and it worked very well when it was tested in the United States in clear blue skies over the deserts with little wind, perfect visibility, and no one shooting at you. But when you apply that over Western Europe, where you've got 8 tenths cloud or 10 tenths cloud, Luftwaffe fighters, anti-aircraft fire coming up, pilots taking evasive maneuvers, and the jet stream and other trade winds playing a part, then, well, and I suppose as well, fear of just wanting to get out of the target area, accuracy just to a degree go out of the window. Um, and the Americans did use systems similar to Bomber Command, like H2S, which they called H2X, which it's a blind bombing technique in aid. So they're employing similar measures to Bomber Command in that regard. Um, you know, James Doolittle, who launched the Doolittle raid against Turkey in 1942 when he took over the US Army Air Force. Whilst on paper, you still had the US Army Air Force adopt precision bombing, the raids that were launched were akin to Bomber Command's area raids, and the results were more or less the same. And I think when you look at the American tactics of flying in box formations, of um, every bomber dropping its bombs when the lead aircraft does, that lends itself as well to area bombing. Because if you've got 1,000 bombers spread out over an area 3 miles wide and 10 miles long, or however long the bomber stream happens to be, you're not just going to hit the factory, you're going to hit the schools, the hospitals, the houses, and whatever else lies in between, which sort of takes away the idea that it was a precision bombing campaign and different from what Bomber Command was doing. And you know, you can't ignore the fact when looking at the argument that the US Army Air Force didn't have any qualms about launching an area bombing campaign. When you look at, say, Turkey in the Firestorm raids of 1945, you know, and to a degree that could be the nature of the war, in as much as Germany was Britain's predominant enemy. We went to war with Germany over Poland, and they were the major threat in Europe. The United States was attacked by Japan. It just so happened Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the United States, which dragged them into the conflict. So you could say they had more reason for having less restraint against Japan than
Mhm.
against Germany. Um, so, I mean, it's a subject which I'm sure historians and anyone with an interest in Bomber Command, the US Army Air Force, and the bombing war more generally will discuss for years to come. The idea of precision bomb against area bombing, the US campaign against the British campaign. Um, but for me, I think that's not a dangerous comparison to make, but a pitfall that we do make when looking at the bombing war is we try and tar Bomber Command with the American brush of, well, if the Americans could do it, why couldn't Bomber Command do it?
Indeed. So I guess in terms of commemoration and reflecting on Bomber Command and in more recent years, the important Bomber Command Memorial was opened in London, but that was a long time coming compared to, say, the Battle of Britain Memorial or similar. So I guess why is that? Why was that path so much tougher than the likes of Fighter Command or for individuals such as Monty? Slim, etc.
Um, well, I think with Fighter Command, obviously they'd saved Britain in 1940, and you've got Churchill's famous words, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The fighters were the salvation. And I think they were a great propaganda tool in that regard. And there was many films made about fighters and you know different aircraft were used from Fighter Command as propaganda tools. You look at posters on Malta or about handing in aluminium that are all Spitfire funds or fighter funds, and the fighters are very much at the forefront, whereas Bomber Command wasn't necessarily there. But I think when it comes to commemoration, it was probably natural that Fighter Command would be commemorated and celebrated in that regard without any qualms, whereas Bomber Command post Dresden was vilified, and I think it became politically unsound to honour Bomber Command. But also, I don't think there was necessarily the public appetite there. With Monty, he'd won El Alamein, which was championed as a great victory. As Churchill said, it wasn't the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. And from there, Monty was very much at the forefront of the British ground campaigns in Italy first, and then, you know, through northern France, took the surrender of Germany on the 5th of May. Slim, obviously, he was the soldier's general, inspired confidence, restored morale over in Burma, and turned around the 14th Army and its fortunes. Um, Whereas Harris in Bomber Command were these not rogue figures, but I don't want to use the word criminal because I don't agree with them being criminals, but they were sort of viewed as such, I would say. You know, in the immediate aftermath of the war, Harris was the only senior commander not to be awarded the peerage. Um, Churchill omitted Bomber Command from his Victory in Europe speech, quite tellingly, well, referencing Fighter Command and the RAF more generally. Um, so I think the shadow of Dresden has loomed large over Bomber Command and has meant that commemoration has been impossible. I think it's only been in recent years with reconciliation and the talk around the fact that all these veterans are getting fewer and fewer, and that they are sort of numbered. That we thought, yeah, it is time to actually honour them because they did sacrifice a lot for king and country, and as I previously mentioned, 55,000 of them made the ultimate sacrifice. They were all volunteers, so it's wrong to deny them that recognition. Um, I mean, in large part, it's been driven by politics because even with the Bomber Command Memorial, government funding wasn't immediately forthcoming. Even up to the 11th hour, the veterans and celebrities like the late Robin Gibb were dipping into their own pockets to try and fund the memorial and fund the opening event. It was only after a media campaign and pressure that the government put its hands in its pockets and sort of stumped up the money.
Mm. Yeah, it's and obviously rightfully so. But yeah, you can. It's interesting, reflecting back from kind of how right at the end of the Second World War in Bomber Command's sphere, they'd reached that kind of pinnacle really in terms of plying their trade. And then meanwhile, over in Japan, the Americans happened to drop a couple of very significant bombs, and I think perhaps at that point that might have altered the perception of bombing to suddenly have these wonder weapons which could devastate to the extent that they did, and um, I think yeah, rightfully in more recent times we have taken that change of stance and that we will commemorate, and that Bomber Command Memorial and other commemorations will be there for generations to come. So I guess for you, Daniel, I mean, how did your impression of Bomber Command, did it change at all while you were working on this project?
Um, I would say it did. I mean, I've never viewed Bomber Command as being war criminals, and I've never viewed Harris as being a war criminal. Um, I've always tried to remain objective in my views of Bomber Command. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's very easy to sit there with the benefit of hindsight and sort of be negative about the campaign and not look at it through the prism of the Second World War and what was known and going on at the time. That's it. The way my perceptions have changed is I've become a bit more sympathetic to them. Not that I wasn't before, but it was more, I didn't view it as inherently wrong. I viewed it as being part and parcel of the war, a means to an end. Whereas conducting the research into writing this book and since then, reflecting on everything, I've thought, well, yes, it is wrong to vilify them. And when you look at the sacrifices and the campaign for recognition and the whole debate about whether they were criminals, whether or not, is the bombing of Dresden as bad as the bombing of Hiroshima or, what we're seeing today in various countries around the world. I think, it's made me think, well, you know, was it all that bad in the grand scheme of things? Are we perhaps blowing things out of proportion and not being subjective? Are we too squeamish, perhaps? As much as obviously we deplore civilian casualties in warfare, um, but we don't. But when civilian casualties occur, we sort of, to a degree, brush them off. It's a crying shame, but it happens. Whereas with Bomber Command and the bombing of Germany, it's a major taboo.
Hmm.
Something I read during the research of this was, Dresden, there's the idea that somewhere between 18,000 and 25,000, as current figures have it, were killed. The Lancaster, while great technology for the time, was a somewhat indiscriminate weapon. It was a weapon of war designed to deliver bombs. And it did its job, it did its job well. But technology compared to today was quite rudimentary. And, the article I read was saying that in 2023, there was an instance in which the RAF had dropped bombs on targets of ISIS in the Middle East, and 23 civilians were killed. And the MOD turned around and said it was regrettable, which it is a regrettable incident because you deplore civilian casualties. But when you think that that is a £10 million fighter jet dropping a £4,000 laser guided bomb with a pilot who's had X amount of man hours training and it's been done in peacetime and he's had X amount of million sort of spent on to do that and he's got the peak technology now. Why isn't that a war crime? Because surely with the technology that we've got now, precision weapons as we like to say we've got, surely we can eliminate civilian casualties in that regard. So if civilians are inadvertently killed, how's that not a war crime? Whereas the destruction of Hamburg, Lübeck, Rostock, Dortmund, Dresden, and half a dozen other cities, a war crime. When you're comparing apples with apples, peak technology then, peak technology now, the results, you know, are not the same, but the outcomes are similar in a moral regard. So I think that's how my perceptions have changed in as much as you can't criticize one without criticizing the other. And if we're not prepared to criticize sort of the armed forces now for situations like that, then what right do we have to criticize what happened during total war? 6 bloody years of conflict.
100%. And I think Bomber Command were objects in, you know, trying to ultimately shorten the war in one respect or another to bring it to a conclusion. And I think obviously with the benefit of hindsight, we now know, oh well, at this point it only had this many months left to run, or at this point it only had this many years to run. But that is obviously looking backwards, not forwards. And I think, these, brave young men who, boarded their Lancasters, Halifaxes, Mosquitoes, Wellingtons, whatever it might have been, did they think, what they were doing was wrong in any way? I don't think so. There would have been maybe the odd kind of humane concern, but ultimately they were doing their bit to, to end the war, to bring about peace. And unfortunately, it can cost lives with the technology of the day. Equally, had the war gone on for another year, how many more lives would have been lost in the Holocaust?
It's a valid question. I mean, as Harris said, he didn't view the remaining German cities as worth the bones of one British grenadier. So, as far as Harris was concerned, he was trying to obviously destroy Germany's capacity to wage war, but with the aim of saving British and Allied lives. You know,
Hmm.
Germany had obviously in 1937 bombed Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, and that had a great morale and terroristic effect on the world. Um, you know, Warsaw, Rotterdam had forced quick capitulations. London was subject to the Blitz, where the Luftwaffe tried to break British morale and the will to resist. Now, what would have happened had Germany not invaded the Soviet Union? And from the middle of May, we called the Luftwaffe to begin that build-up. We don't know, but you could say that what Bomber Command tried to do in targeting German cities was exactly what the Germans had tried to do to us. And there's a focus on the firestorms, which weren't an exact science. Bomber Command didn't have a magic recipe of being able to create them at will. There was three conditions involved, and it's overlooked that the mathematics and science behind the firestorm actually came from the British studying what the Germans had done during the Blitz and working out the ratio of explosives to incendiaries. And Hamburg was a prime example of everything coming together to create a perfect firestorm. Dresden was an unfortunate incident. Yeah, the Germans recognized that Hamburg had the situation had been repeated across 10 different cities, probably would have forced a capitulation. If Bomber Command knew that and could have done that, would they've repeated it? Probably, because it would have brought an end to the war. But it didn't happen, so we'll never know. And it was just a case of chance created the firestorms by and large. And, Dresden and the fallout from there has been one of the unfortunate results of that.
Definitely. And I think finally, as we kind of draw towards a close, I think it's interesting the end of the First World War, how obviously the blockade had such a significant contribution towards the end of that war, and yet the Royal Navy, remained, very much in, a jewel in the public perception, I would say, definitely, the senior service, etc. So, and yet, obviously, with how the World War ended, that we had this lasting kind of legacy of bomber command, which thankfully, I think through your kind of your musings tonight, I think through how you've gone about the book, I think you've really shown how, as a nation, we've gone on that journey, um, through the decades, and we're in the kind of perhaps more kind of reasoned and balanced position that we're in today.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue with that. Without doubt, there's been changes, but we focus on the bombing of enemy cities with Bomber Command, but it's often overlooked that its last operations of the Second World War were humanitarian, dropping parcels of food to starving people of Holland. So while it was a weapon of war, it was also a weapon of salvation to a degree.
Completely, completely. Well, thanks, Dan, for going through all of that with me. I found that really enjoyable, really kind of stimulating conversation. As obviously, I know you're going through a bit of a house move shortly, so that's gonna take time. I can sympathise. But will you return? What would be next on your kind of writing list?
Yeah, I've got a couple of books which I'm using and working on at the moment. One is a new history of the hunt for the Bismarck in May 1941, because I think it's a subject area which it's been explored, but there's a lot of elements which are neglected in the current historiography. Um, and another topic which I'm really in the depths of researching at the moment is Black Thursday, subject which I touched on earlier, which was the raid of 16th of 17th of December 1943, part of the Battle of Berlin, where Bomber Command set out to target the big city for the sixth raid of the campaign. A handful of aircraft were lost over the target, but then upon return, the vast majority of the airfields were shrouded in fog, and more airmen died through crashes in Britain than died over the target or died through enemy action or the results and causes, which I think it's one of the great tragedies of the war. As much as returning back to Britain should have been sort of a welcome experience, a sigh of relief for a lot of the airmen. So to have to have gone through the whole psychological build-up of an operation to then endure hell over enemy territory, being chased by night fighters and enduring flak and participating in a bombing run, to then come back and find that home isn't that welcoming place that you left, and that, home was to a degree deadly, is a fascinating subject,
Mhm.
and a tragic one which has been somewhat overlooked in the wider historiography of the air campaign, and one with further study.
Well, both sound like interesting prospects. So whether we find you at sea or in the air over Berlin, I'm sure it will be a good read in due course. So I guess yeah, thank you again. If you haven't already got a copy of Daniel's book, please check out our website, which is barnthornpublishing.co.uk, or alternatively, Amazon stocks it as well. So yeah, thank you very much. I will end the recording there, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.